I'd like to welcome to the stage Dr. Siddhartha Mukherjee.
Thank you so much. We do go a long way back. Susan, if I remember correctly, you were my chief resident. And if I was not always present, it was because I was doing something else, like writing books. So you should forgive me. Thank you for this kind honor, and thank you, John and Mindy. I applaud the critical work of the Basser Initiative and the Abraham Cancer Center. Your commitment to research on the BRCA1 genes in particular and in cancer genetics in general extends beyond our understanding of just one type of cancer. And it's very important to remember that there's a whole domain of cancers that are likely to be transformed by this research. This research has already had wide-ranging implications for many diseases and will continue to have broad implications in the future. The journey through genetics is a personal story for all of us. For me, it is my family history of mental illness, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorder. The defining questions of my childhood were to seek answers about why we're affected by some of these illnesses. Why are some of us affected and why not others? What makes one person susceptible and not his brother? In a sense, it's only apt that this journey would intersect with my professional life. I'm now, as many of you know, I'm now an oncologist by training. I also run a laboratory. Cancer is a genetic disease at its very core, and the world of cancer has already been rewritten through genetic research. Obviously, we are here because our understanding of the BRCA1 gene and the BRCA2 genes and the family of genes that surround these genes is under transformation. Research on these genes has allowed us to identify patients that have an increased risk for breast and other cancers and to preemptively treat these cancers. Tens of thousands and soon hundreds of thousands of lives have been and will be transformed by these treatments and diagnostic modalities. And as many of you know, we're now entering an era when big questions loom on how to deepen our understanding of risk. How do other gene variants influence the risk of developing breast cancer in a woman with BRCA1 gene mutation? How or why does the environment add or subtract from this risk? How can we give the best advice to women with BRCA1 mutations to manage their care? What is the best therapy if they should develop cancer? And how do we manage the risks in a younger woman versus an older woman? In the summer of 1983, the doctor, writer, and occasional poet Lewis Thomas published an enormously influential book called The Youngest Science: Notes of a Medicine Watcher. If that book had been written today, a more appropriate title might have been The Adolescent Science. We're in the midst of a stormy and contentious transition of a young discipline into maturity. In short, we're in the growing up phase of medicine. Much of this growing up has to do with our understanding of genes and the profound influence that genes have on our lives, fates, destinies, and identities. When I was preparing for this talk, I went back to this recent book, The Gene. Actually, I wrote this book. Obviously, I didn't know the work of the Basser Foundation. I was surprised at how many times BRCA comes up in this book. It comes up, when I looked through the index, it comes up 10 times in a book on the future and the history of human genetics, partly because it's such an exemplar of the power and the transformative potential of using genetics to predict risk. So I thought I would read one paragraph or two paragraphs about where this thinking has gone and how, again, BRCA has become an exemplar of how we think about cancer risk, how we think about mitigating risk, and potentially how we think about treatment. In the summer of 2008, I met a woman with a family history of breast cancer. Jane Sterling, it's a pseudonym, was a 37-year-old nurse from the North Shore of Massachusetts. The story of her family could have been plucked straight out of Mary Claire King's case files. This is a reference to Mary Claire King's work. A great-grandmother with breast cancer at an early age, a grandmother who had had a radical mastectomy for cancer at 45, a mother who had had bilateral breast cancer at 60. Sterling had 2 daughters. She had known about BRCA testing for nearly a decade. When her first daughter was born, she had considered the test but neglected to follow it up. But with the birth of the second daughter and the diagnosis of breast cancer in a close friend, she finally came to terms with gene testing. Sterling tested positive for the BRCA mutation. 2 weeks later, she returned to the clinic armed with sheaves of paper scribbled with questions. What would she do with the knowledge of this diagnosis? Women with BRCA1 gene mutations may have up to an 80% lifetime risk of breast cancer, but the genetic test tells a woman nothing about when she might develop the cancer, nor the kind of cancer that she might develop. Since the mutation has incomplete penetrance, a woman with the mutation might develop inoperable, aggressive, therapy-resistant cancer at age 30, or she might develop therapy-sensitive variant at age 50, or a smoldering variant at age 75. What should she tell her daughters about the diagnosis? Some of the women with mutations hate their mothers, one writer who tested positive herself wrote. This hatred of mothers alone illuminates a chronic misunderstanding of genetics and its debilitating effects on the human psyche. The mutant genes are as likely to be inherited from a mother as it is from a father. Would Sterling inform her sisters? What about her second cousins? What about her aunt? The uncertainties about outcome were compounded by the uncertainties about choices of therapy. She could choose to do nothing, to wait and watch. She could choose to have mastectomies and/or ovarian removal to diminish her risk, cutting off her breasts despite her genes, as one woman with mutations described it. She could seek intensive screening with mammograms, self-examinations, and MRIs to detect early breast cancer, or she could choose to take a hormonal medicine which would decrease the risk of some but not all breast cancer. This shows how far we've come from her grandmother and her great-grandmother's case, where the options were limited. The capacity to screen and tell people about their future risk was extraordinarily limited. The discovery of the draft sequence of the human genome in 2003 was an indisputable milestone in our understanding, and yet it has created many questions as it has answered. How much of that human experience is determined by the environment? What will happen when we learn to read and write our own genetic instructions? Or as John Silston, the biologist, put it, what will happen when a machine learns to read its own manual? I'm pleased to say, perhaps for the first time in a public forum, that in 2019, filmmaker Ken Burns and PBS will help further the conversation on genetics, a national conversation on genetics, when they produce a comprehensive documentary series based on this second book, The Gene and Intimate History. Now we know that there are devastating diseases for which there are no answers, but we also know, with BRCA as an exemplar, that there are cancers that we once thought impossible to treat or to preemptively diagnose or screen for, and these genetic discoveries were made in the 80s and 90s and are coming to life today. Immunotherapy, the idea that cancers could resist being killed by the immune system by activating certain genetic pathways, is also an idea that came out of genetics. T-cell trials, modified immune cells, are gene therapies that recognize and kill cancer cells, other ideas that came out of our understandings of genetics in the last few decades. Next year is the 15th anniversary of the Human Genome Project. Through it, we have gained moral, biological, medical, and biochemical lessons. We've learned, for instance, that genetics sits at the core of our cells, and the new therapies causing the revolution in how we think about illness, prevention, and treatment. But to end, I would caution that there are risks and excesses and there are moral and philosophical consequences that lie beyond medicine and science as we explore this new world of genetics and genomics. As the political theorist Desmond King puts it, one way or another, we're all going to be dragged into a regime of gene management. It will be in the name of individual health rather than for overall fitness of the populations, and the managers will be you and me and the doctors and the state. But we must recall that such regimes of management can drive fundamental inequalities in our societies that are already unequal. When one population can access genetic tests while another population does not get screened or cannot get screened because of price, we begin to drive deeper rifts in society. And these rifts are not just cultural or economic, but they become genetic risks. I like to think of the genome as a massive plea for equality and equanimity. Human variation abounds, we know, but our genomes are also more similar than dissimilar. We are, after all, a surprisingly young species. We haven't been around for very long, just 300,000 odd years, a tick-tock in evolutionary time. So in fact, despite dissimilarities, the genome is a plea for a kind of radical conception of human equality. As we move forward into a new era of genetics and genomics, it is this fundamental desire to achieve equality, despite variation, that will mark the new century of the gene. Thank you very much. Thank you.